Ever wondered what marriage was really like for women in medieval times? Did you know that a woman could be married off without even being present at her own wedding? Number 10. The morning gift system. After the wedding night came an unusual tradition that might make modern women raise their eyebrows. The morning gift, or Morgengabe, was a payment from husband to wife, following the consummation of their marriage. This practice, which spread across much of medieval Europe, saw husbands presenting their new brides with property, jewelry, or other valuables the morning after their first night together. While it might sound like a sweet gesture at first glance, the morning gift served a far more practical purpose. It was essentially compensation for the woman's virginity and acknowledged that she had fulfilled her duty as a new wife. In many regions, this gift became the woman's personal property, one of the few things she might genuinely own in her lifetime. In Germanic territories, the Morgengabe became so formalized that it was often specified in marriage contracts. The size of the gift typically reflected the husband's wealth and social status. A noblewoman might receive lands or extensive property, while a peasant wife might get a cow or household items. Some historians believe the practice evolved as a form of widow insurance, ensuring a woman would have some means of support if her husband died. What made this practice particularly unusual was how public and formalized it became. In some regions, witnesses would wait outside the marital chamber, and the morning gift would be presented with family members present, turning what modern people might consider an intensely private moment into a public economic transaction. The morning gift gradually disappeared in most of Europe by the late medieval period, though similar customs persisted in some forms. While it gave women some economic protection, it also reinforced the idea that a woman's value was directly tied to her sexuality and reproductive capacity. Number 9. Married. Imagine being legally wed to someone you've never met, in a ceremony you didn't even attend. For many medieval women, especially noble women, this wasn't just possible, it was common practice. Proxy marriages allowed weddings to take place when one or both parties couldn't be physically present, with stand-ins taking the vows on their behalf. These arrangements were particularly common in diplomatic marriages, between royal or noble families from different countries. A princess might find herself legally married to a foreign prince while still in her home country, with a diplomat or court official standing in for her distant groom. In some particularly extreme cases, both bride and groom might be absent, with the entire ceremony conducted between representatives. The Catholic Church recognized these marriages as completely valid, provided the absent party had given proper consent beforehand. This meant that technically, a woman could become a wife without ever saying her vows or even being in the same room as her husband. Perhaps the most famous medieval proxy marriage was that of Margaret of Anjou to King Henry VI of England in 1445. The marriage was conducted in Nancy, France, with the Earl of Suffolk standing in for the English king. Margaret didn't meet her actual husband until months after becoming Queen of England. For noble women, the aftermath of a proxy marriage often meant leaving behind everything familiar to travel to a foreign land to live with a husband they had never met. Imagine the anxiety of finally meeting the man who was already your legal husband, knowing your family was now hundreds of miles away and your future completely tied to this stranger. While proxy marriages served practical diplomatic purposes, they highlight how little control medieval women had over their most important life decisions. The practice reduced marriage to a legal and political transaction that could be completed without the bride's physical presence or participation. Number 8. The consent-only marriage. Did you know medieval couples could legally marry with just a few simple words exchanged in private? Before the Council of Trent in 1563, the Catholic Church recognized marriages based solely on mutual consent. No priest, No witnesses, no fancy ceremony required. These clandestine marriages, or consent-only marriages, required only that both parties express their present consent to be married to each other. In theory, simply stating, "I take you as my husband-wife," could create a binding marriage. This doctrine, based on the principle that consent made the marriage rather than formal ceremonies, had profound implications for women. On one hand, this simplified approach to marriage occasionally allowed women some agency in choosing their partners. Secret marriages sometimes enabled couples to wed despite family opposition. The famous story of Romeo and Juliet, though fictional, reflects the real possibility of such secret unions during medieval times. However, this system created serious problems for women. Without witnesses or documentation, men could claim a marriage had occurred when it hadn't, or deny a marriage that had actually taken place. Women who believed themselves properly married might suddenly find their husband denying the union ever existed, leaving them with ruined reputations and no legal protection. Disputes over whether a valid marriage had occurred became common in medieval church courts. Women would testify that consent had been exchanged, while men would deny it, often leaving the woman's word against the man's. Even worse, if a woman had consented to a secret marriage and then her family arranged another, more advantageous match, she could find herself technically committing bigamy by going through with the arranged marriage. The Church eventually recognized these problems. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 required marriages to be publicly announced in advance through bans. But clandestine marriages remained technically valid until the Council of Trent. For centuries, this created a strange dual system where marriages could be illicit, performed without proper procedure, yet still valid in the eyes of the Church. This legal loophole meant medieval women faced uncertainty even in what should have been their most secure relationship. A marriage that existed today could be denied tomorrow, leaving women particularly vulnerable to abandonment without legal recourse. Number 7. The use it or lose it consummation wrong. Marriage wasn't considered fully binding until it was physically consummated, creating a bizarre window where marriages could be easily nullified. This requirement put enormous pressure on medieval brides, who knew their status remained uncertain until the marriage was complete. Medieval canon law distinguished between marriages that were per verba di presenti, by words of the present, and marriages that were per verba di presenti et carnali copula subsecuta, by words of the present and subsequent carnal coupling. Only the latter was considered absolutely indissoluble. Until consummation, a marriage could be annulled relatively easily if either party chose to enter religious life or as certain other impediments were discovered. For women, this created a precarious situation where their status as wife wasn't fully secure until after the wedding night. Royal and noble marriages in particular were often political arrangements that might become inconvenient as alliances shifted. There are documented cases of political marriages being dissolved before consummation when they no longer served a useful purpose. Consider the famous case of Margaret Beaufort, who gave birth to the future King Henry VII when she was just 13 years old. After fulfilling her reproductive duties so young, she managed to avoid further physical relationships in her subsequent marriages by claiming they were unconsummated, using to her advantage the very rule that placed many women in vulnerable positions. The requirement for consummation also led to the disturbing practice of bedding ceremonies. In some regions, where newlyweds might be escorted to their marriage bed by wedding guests, who sometimes remained nearby to ensure the marriage was completed. In royal marriages, official witnesses might even verify the consummation, an intrusion into privacy that would be unthinkable today. For women who couldn't or didn't consummate their marriages, the consequences could be severe. They might find themselves suddenly unmarried, their dowries in jeopardy, and their reputations damaged. This legal requirement reinforced the idea that a woman's primary marital function was reproductive, with her comfort and consent secondary considerations. Number 6. Property ownership restrictions. When a medieval woman married, she essentially ceased to exist as a legal entity. Under the legal principle of coverture widely practiced across medieval Europe, a wife's legal existence was covered by her husband's. This meant she could not own property, sign contracts, or engage in business without her husband's permission. In England, the common law was particularly strict. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Any property a woman owned before marriage automatically transferred to her husband's control, and anything she earned or inherited during marriage immediately became his. Even a woman's clothing and personal items legally belonged to her husband. If a woman attempted to sell her own clothes without permission, both she and the buyer could be charged with theft because she was selling her husband's property. Some regions developed systems to soften these harsh restrictions. In parts of France and Germany, community property systems gave wives theoretical co-ownership of marital assets, though the husband maintained control over management. In northern Italian city-states, some married women maintained limited rights to their dowries. Widowhood often marked the only time a medieval woman might exercise significant economic independence. A widow was entitled to her dower rights, typically a third of her husband's property, which she could control until her death or remarriage. This created the paradoxical situation where widowhood could offer women more freedom and economic power than they had as wives. The property restrictions placed on married women weren't just economic limitations. They reinforced women's complete dependence on their husbands. Without independent resources, a woman in an unhappy or abusive marriage had few options for escape. The rare medieval woman who managed to maintain control over property often did so through special legal arrangements that required significant family influence or exceptional circumstances. Perhaps most startling to modern sensibilities, these property restrictions didn't fade with the Middle Ages, but persisted for centuries after. In England and America, married women couldn't fully own property in their own names until the late 19th century, showing just how deeply rooted these medieval concepts remained in Western legal traditions. Number 5. Child marriages and betrothals. How young could medieval girls be legally married? The answer is disturbing by modern standards. Canon law set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But betrothals could happen at virtually any age, even infancy. These child marriages were most common among nobility, where marriages were strategic alliances between families rather than personal choices. Historical records show numerous cases of girls being betrothed before they could walk and married before puberty. Margaret Beaufort, mentioned earlier, was married at age 12 and gave birth at 13, a situation that was unusual but not scandalous by medieval standards. While church law technically required consent from both parties, in practice, young children had little say in the matter. The concept of meaningful consent from a 7-year-old being promised to a 30-year-old man would be completely foreign to medieval thinking. There was one small protection. Marriages involving children under the minimum age were considered inchoate or incomplete until both reached the legal age and consented to continue the marriage. This created a theoretical window for repudiation when the child reached 12 or 14, though family pressure and practical circumstances often made this impossible. For very young brides, marriages were sometimes not immediately consummated, with the girl sent to live in her husband's household to be raised by his family until she reached puberty. This practice created the disturbing dynamic where a girl's future husband might participate in her upbringing, blurring the lines between guardian and spouse. The physiological toll of early marriages was severe. Medical historians note that girls who became pregnant shortly after puberty suffered higher rates of maternal mortality and delivered less healthy infants. Many noble families lost daughters to complications of early childbearing, a risk considered acceptable, given the political advantages of early marriage alliances. While peasant families typically waited until girls were older and physically capable of managing household duties before arranging marriages, economic necessity still pushed many peasant girls into marriage by their mid-teens. Across all social classes, the concept of childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Children were seen as small adults with adult responsibilities, including marriage and reproduction. Number 4. Limited divorce options. What happened when a medieval marriage became unbearable? Unlike today, divorce as we know it wasn't an option for most medieval women. The Catholic Church considered marriage a sacrament and therefore indissoluble. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Instead of divorce, medieval canon law offered two limited alternatives. The first was annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Grounds for annulment included pre-existing marriage, close blood relationship, impotence, or lack of consent. Proving these grounds was difficult and expensive, putting annulments beyond reach of most common women. Wealthy or royal women occasionally succeeded in securing annulments, but usually only with significant political or family backing. The second option was separation from bed and board, a mense thoro, which allowed couples to live apart without permission to remarry. These separations might be granted in cases of extreme cruelty, adultery, or abandonment. However, financial entanglements remain, and neither party could remarry while the other lived. For women trapped in dangerous marriages, the practical options were even more limited than the legal ones. A woman fleeing an abusive husband might find shelter in a convent temporarily, but her husband retained legal rights to compel her return. Some desperate women simply disappeared, moving to distant towns and living under assumed names, a perilous choice that often meant abandoning children and living in poverty. The few documented cases of successful separations typically involved extreme circumstances. In 1388, Elizabeth Mowbray secured a separation after proving her husband had attempted to murder her multiple times. In another case, a woman named Marjorie de Resby received protection from her husband after showing the church court her broken arm and other injuries from his beatings. These rare successes highlight how difficult it was to escape even the most dangerous marriages. For the vast majority of medieval women, marriage truly was until death do us part, whether that marriage was happy or hellish. This rigid approach to marital permanence left countless women trapped in unsafe or unhappy situations with no legal recourse, forcing many to simply endure whatever treatment they received at their husband's hands. Number 3. Legal wife-beating allowances. It's shocking but true. Medieval law explicitly permitted husbands to physically discipline their wives. The infamous rule of thumb, supposedly allowing a husband to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than his thumb, may be a later invention, but the legal right to moderate correction was very real. Throughout medieval Europe, a husband's authority over his household included the right to physically punish his wife for perceived misbehavior. This right was endorsed by religious authorities, legal codes, and cultural norms alike. Thomas Aquinas, the influential 13th century theologian, wrote that a wife should be subject to chastisement, while legal texts routinely included wife-beating within a husband's corrective powers. The limits of acceptable violence varied by region and era. Some local courts did intervene in extreme cases where violence was deemed excessive. In 15th century France, a husband who beat his wife excessively or unreasonably might face legal consequences. The key word here is excessively, implying that a certain level of violence was completely acceptable. Court records reveal cases of severely beaten wives seeking protection, usually only when the violence threatened their lives. In 1395, a London woman named Margaret Nefford secured a restraining order against her husband after he threatened to kill her. The court ordered him to treat her well and amicably as a husband should treat his wife, but notably did not forbid all physical punishment. Perhaps most disturbing was how violence against wives was often treated as a private family matter rather than a criminal offense. Neighbors and community members typically intervened only in the most extreme cases, and even then might simply encourage the husband to moderate his behavior rather than stop it entirely. The right to chastise wives remained legally protected long after the medieval period. In England, the right wasn't formally abolished until 1891, and even then domestic violence remained largely beyond legal reach. This medieval concept of a husband's corrective authority cast a long shadow through legal history, affecting women's safety and autonomy for centuries. Number 2. The double standard of adultery. Unfaithful in medieval marriage. The consequences depended entirely on your gender. For medieval women, adultery wasn't just a marital transgression. It was a crime that could result in severe punishment or even death, while men's extramarital activities faced far milder social and legal consequences. This double standard was in code in medieval law across Europe. In parts of Italy, an adulterous wife could legally be killed by her husband. In England, a husband could sue his wife's lover for damages, effectively treating adultery as a property crime against the husband rather than a moral failing of the male lover. Meanwhile, a woman had no equivalent right to sue her husband's mistress. The concern with female fidelity stemmed partly from inheritance issues. A husband's paternity had to be certain for proper inheritance, while a wife's extramarital children created no similar confusion about maternal lineage. This practical concern evolved into an extensive and unbalanced moral framework that demanded absolute fidelity from wives while tacitly accepting male infidelity. The consequences for adulterous women could be brutally public. In many regions, unfaithful wives might be subject to public humiliation rituals. In parts of Germany, an adulterous woman might be forced to wear a special stone around her neck and parade through town. In France, such women might be stripped and paraded through the streets. These public shaming rituals had no male equivalent. Even women who were victims of sexual assault rather than willing participants in adultery could face severe punishment. The burden of proof fell heavily on women to demonstrate they had resisted sufficiently, with medieval legal codes often specifying that a woman needed to cry out loudly enough for others to hear. Without witnesses to her resistance, a married woman might be convicted of adultery rather than recognized as a victim of assault. The legal double standard extended to property rights as well. A husband could legally disinherit his wife for a single proven incident of adultery, while a wife had no right to claim abandonment or seek financial remedy, no matter how flagrant or numerous her husband's infidelities. This asymmetrical treatment of sexual fidelity reflected and reinforced women's status as subordinate in medieval marriage, creating a system where male sexual freedom coincided with female sexual control. The long-term legacy of this double standard shaped social attitudes toward gender and fidelity that persisted long after the Middle Ages ended. Number 1. The marital debt went. Did you know medieval wives could be legally obligated to have sex with their husbands whenever demanded? The concept of the marital debt, or a conjugal debt, was a cornerstone of medieval marriage law that fundamentally shaped women's bodily autonomy, or lack thereof. The term debt was quite literal in medieval thinking. Both husband and wife were considered to owe sexual access to each other, with refusal seen as a sin and potential grounds for annulment. However, This theoretically mutual obligation played out very differently for women and men in practice. The concept stemmed from St. Paul's writings in 1 Corinthians. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Medieval theologians and canon lawyers expanded this into a comprehensive doctrine that effectively eliminated the concept of marital rape. While the debt was technically reciprocal, church authorities generally favored husbands in disputes. Thomas Aquinas wrote that wives owed submission to their husbands, especially in the act of marriage. Other theological writings suggested that women who refused their husbands without good reason, with good defined very narrowly, were committing a mortal sin. What constituted legitimate reasons for refusing? Medieval penitential manuals and theological works provided limited exceptions: menstruation, late pregnancy, illness, or immediately after childbirth. Religious observances, like Lent, might also provide temporary exemptions. Beyond these, refusal was considered sinful and potentially damaging to the marriage. The marital debt concept proved remarkably durable. Well into the early modern period, women were appearing in church courts accused by their husbands of withholding the marital debt. Court records show cases where women were ordered to return to their husbands and fulfill their duty regardless of their personal wishes. This doctrine created a world where women's bodies were legally available to their husbands without consideration of consent. The assumption that marriage automatically meant perpetual sexual consent persisted in Western legal systems for centuries. Marital rape exemptions were fully eliminated from U.S. law until the 1990s. The marital debt concept represents perhaps the most intimate way medieval marriage law restricted women's autonomy. At its core, it declared that upon marriage, a woman surrendered control over her most personal bodily boundaries, creating a legal framework where her consent became irrelevant within marriage. Have you ever wondered how many of these medieval marriage practices might still subtly influence our thinking about gender and relationships today?